made, or is it for the reason that it believes that perhaps this also enhances its status, being on the same sort of category as the United States as a nuclear superpower? That is something to be discussed, but I think it is important that this has taken place. So that's my first point. My second point is that with regard to the issue of Taiwan, my feeling is that the US has walked back at least to its earlier position of recognizing that there is only one China, not supporting an independent Taiwan. So while tensions in the Taiwan Strait are unlikely to subside very significantly, the guardrails that Biden had spoken about, that we should avoid miscalculation and unintended conflict, I think those guardrails at least have been put in place, even though perhaps they are somewhat fragile at this point. What I found interesting was that this morning I was reading some of the Chinese language press, and there is a Chinese readout on what Biden is supposed to have said on the Taiwan issue. And this says, I quote, "The US government is committed to pursuing the long-standing and consistent one China policy, does not support Taiwan independence, and hopes that the Taiwan Strait region will remain peaceful and stable." This is a statement attributed to Biden. The third important sign is of a positive turn in the relationship is, of course, relating to the cooperation, very substantive cooperation, which is envisaged between China and the US on the issue of climate change. And you would have seen over the 2 weeks that we had the Glasgow Climate Summit, if you were watching the TV, it is amazing how much of, consultations were taking place between, John Kerry and Xie Zhenhua, who's the chief negotiator on the Chinese side. As you know, on the 10th of November, just 2 days before the climate summit ended, the US and China came out with a joint declaration on cooperation on climate change, a very important document. And if you see some of the contents of that joint declaration, you will see them also reflected then in the Glasgow Pact. Now, it brought me some memories of what happened in 2015 in Paris, because that also document was very much influenced by an earlier US-China pact on climate change. Some of the language, in fact, used in the Paris Agreement were drawn from the joint China-US statement. And we see something similar, not to perhaps to the same extent, but we see something similar here as well. For example, the phrase phase down of unabated coal being used for power finds exact reference in the Glasgow Pact. The importance attached to mitigation of methane, almost exactly the same thing has been reflected in the Glasgow Pact. So on climate change also, I think important. And very interestingly, Xie Zhenhua gave a press conference introducing the China-US declaration, which he described as a very important document. But he also said that, prior to the Glasgow summit, that he and Kerry had interacted with one another 11 times online and 3 times in person. So that is pretty intense engagement, on the issue of climate change. So if I put all this together, it appears to me that perhaps there was more substantive outcome than perhaps has been expected. And therefore, this changes, when you have great power relations, even a rather small shift can have important consequences. Lastly, I would also point out that something which is not so far mentioned in the Western press relates to what Xi Jinping is supposed to have said to Biden on the economic issue. And this is important. Xi Jinping is supposed to have said, it is necessary for China and the US to maintain macroeconomic policy communication to support the world economic recovery. The US side should pay attention to the spillover effects of domestic macro policies and adopt responsible macroeconomic policies. So that's also very interesting that is not only on the important nuclear issue, but also on the rather important question of macroeconomic coordination between the two countries. The need for that is also reflected here. All in all, my view is more substance than perhaps we may have anticipated or may have been reflected so far in the reports that we see. And naturally, I would also say that this would certainly have an impact on how India is going to look at the whole geopolitical situation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran, for being absolutely on the spot for wrapping up in 10 minutes. That was really remarkable on such a vast topic. And as you said, contrary to what we see in the media, this meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping has been more substantive. So with these, I'll just pick up one small thread from what you mentioned earlier about, you mentioned the guardrails have been put, howsoever fragile they might be, to take care of any unintended accident or incident happening in the Taiwan Straits. So I'm picking up this thread because that will put in perspective what our next speaker, Professor Gerson, perhaps is going to speak. And also, I must mention this thing that in addition to his long-standing efforts and activism to make the world more peaceful, Professor Gerson early this year, just before Biden took office, had taken an initiative with the help of various colleagues and NGOs and think tank organizations and organized a signature campaign which was submitted to President Biden to appealing to him to reduce the tensions between China and America. But as it were, as we see, a section of experts, of course, believes that since Biden has come to office, the tensions have actually escalated than it were before he took the office. Anyway, with these words, now I request Professor Joseph Gerson to take the floor.
Thank you very much. It being early here, I'm going to be reading a speech. I apologize for that, but you want to hear something coherent. So I want to thank Professor Akata for the invitation to join today's webinar. And I think you'll see that in many ways, at least at the beginning of my talk, there's a lot of agreement with Ambassador Saran, although I'm not quite as optimistic as he is. Simply to say that the meeting was short of signaling a new détente, but we were able to briefly exhale earlier this week when Presidents Biden and Xi met virtually in their effort to halt and stabilize the exceedingly dangerous free fall of US-Chinese competition. There was also encouragement a week ago in the Kerry-Xi COP26 climate summit statement. In both cases, there were few substantive agreements, but the dialogues and the symbolism were important. In his meeting with Biden this week, China's newly appointed helmsman proposed talks and cooperation with the US on economic, energy, military, educational, technological, cyber, and environmental protection. Without agreeing on how and when they will begin, there was apparent agreement on the need for high-level negotiations to prevent miscommunication from triggering runaway military escalations in what President Biden has euphemistically termed the great powers' intense competition. And you will note that Biden has reiterated that that's what the US policy is about. That said, there was no change in the structural foundations of our 21st century Thucydides trap, the inevitable tensions between rising and declining powers that over time have too often resulted in catastrophic wars. Twice in the 20th century, the dominant US and British powers failed to find ways to accommodate the rising German and Japanese powers, resulting in catastrophic wars. Now, a number of international leaders and others point to the mounting pressures over Taiwan as, quote, eerily evoking how Europe went to war in 1914, close quote. The current moment may be more dangerous than the Cold War, which shaped so many of our lives. Look to the disturbing similarities between our time and the period leading up to World War I. Tensions between rising and declining powers, complex alliance structures, now including AUKUS and the Quad, intense nationalism with intense hatreds, territorial disputes, arms race with new technologies, international economic integration and competition, autocracies, and wild card actors. Adding to the dangers is the toxic Washington consensus, excepting Bernie Sanders and a few others, that China poses an existential threat to the United States and that its global system must be defended at all costs. The Biden administration's interim strategic guidelines were clear in declaring that China remains a strategic competitor that requires preparations for possible great power war, and that the confrontation with China requires an all-government priority. John Mearsheimer, the hardcore belligerent realist, articulates in the current issue of Foreign Affairs, writing that, quote, today China and the United States are locked into what can only be called a new Cold War, an intense security competition that touches on every dimension of their relationship. And this Cold War is more likely to turn hot, end quote. More than a few Republican and Pentagon leaders believe that war with China is inevitable. There were hopes that President Biden would break ranks with the Trump-Pompeo escalation of tensions with China. But as Richard Haass, president of the Council of Foreign Relations, writes, quote, there is far more continuity between the foreign policy of the current president and that of Trump than is typically recognized, with the most important element being the centrality of great power rivalry, above all with China. Haass reminds us that aspects of the continuity precede Trump. Even as they pursued neoliberal engagement with China, the W. Bush and Obama administrations sought to contain and manage China's rise by reinforcing the ring of alliances and bases that nearly surround China. This included diplomacy designed to entice India to join the containment campaign. Recall that Indian Prime Minister Vajpayee was the first foreign head of state welcomed by Obama to the White House for a state visit. And it was Kurt Campbell, now Biden's National Security Council Indo-Pacific czar, who led the AUKUS alliance negotiations, and it was he who conceived the Obama-Clinton pivot to Asia and the deployment of 60% of US air and naval forces to the region that has followed. With his four-nation summit and joint military exercises, Biden and company have built on Trump's Quad. Perhaps more dangerously, they have joined the Trump-era assault on the One China policy, albeit a modification in the last couple of days, with additional arms sales and high-level diplomatic engagements to Taiwan. There have been repeated deployments of US and allied warships to the Taiwan Straits, and you will note that Biden and his cohort have reiterated their rock-solid commitments to Taiwan. At the same time, as our Committee for Sane US-China Policy colleague Professor Selden remarked, Beijing is not simply an innocent victim of aggressive US containment provocations. Hundreds of PLA warplanes have penetrated Taiwan's ADIZ. Beijing claims exclusive territorial fishing and mining rights throughout the South China Sea, and it uses its military might to reinforce those claims. China is increasingly reliant on coal, as is India, I'm afraid to say, sorry to say, and coal's resulting climate change greenhouse gases. There was, as you will recall, a mini war with India, and Beijing's repression of Uyghurs, the democratic forces in Hong Kong, and its deepening autocratic rule across China have and still limit the ability of the two great powers to explore risk reduction and strategic stability negotiations. The Pentagon's annual China report to Congress just a couple weeks ago warned that by 2030, China could quadruple the size of its nuclear arsenal to 1,000 warheads. In doing so, it failed to mention that this number is less than half of the number of nuclear weapons the U.S. has based in the state of New Mexico. This report was followed by General Milley's hyped warning that China's recent hypersonic missile test was, quote, a Sputnik moment. Those who are old enough to remember it will know that when Russia, Soviet Union, sent the first satellite around the Earth, there was absolute panic here in the United States. The Pentagon's timing was exquisite. Its terrorizing red flag is being waved in the midst of the Biden administration's nuclear posture review, which will set the country's nuclear warfighting doctrines and weapons acquisition plans for years to come. It also comes amidst congressional debates over funding for Washington's first strike nuclear warfighting arsenal. As the Washington Post reported, the Biden administration, including the Pentagon, is locked in a nuclear posture review debate over possible adoption of a sole-use, retaliatory, as opposed to first strike nuclear doctrine. The ostensible China threat also serves as a powerful antidote to growing, but not yet decisive opposition in Congress and beyond to deploying a new generation of land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles and the destabilizing standoff air-launched cruise missiles, which threat the survival of China's minimum but very deadly deterrent nuclear arsenal. U.S. military and political leaders and the uncritical press have doggedly disregarded the disconcerting reality that Beijing's apparent plans to move from minimum to medium deterrence are realpolitik and defensive responses to the U.S. first strike nuclear warfighting doctrine and to the decade and a half of the U.S. military buildup in Indo-Pacific now. More worrisome to Chinese leaders has been the buildup of U.S. land and sea-based missile defenses. While there is a defensive rationale for these deployments to protect the hundreds of U.S. military bases in South Korea, Japan, and Guam that surround North Korea and China, as well as protecting their allied populations, strategically, they also theoretically serve as shields to reinforce U.S. first strike swords. With its relatively small, if genocidal, minimum deterrent arsenal of 250 to 300 nuclear weapons, facing Washington's reported 5,550, China's strategic thinkers fear that in an escalating crisis over Taiwan or in the South China Sea, the U.S. might launch a disarming first strike nuclear attack to eliminate Beijing's deterrent nuclear arsenal. In this scenario, U.S. missile defenses would be used to mop up any Chinese nuclear armed missiles that survived the U.S. first strike attack and which could be launched in retaliation. This possible scenario reinforces lessons from the Opium War, the Boxer Rebellion, and the Nanjing Massacre, when China and its people were defenseless against and ultimately devastated by overwhelming power of foreign powers. Do the Chinese really have reason to worry? It's true that Biden and Putin reiterated that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But it was the US that eviscerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic weapons, and which is now deploying, quote, more usable, unquote, nuclear weapons. During the 1955 and 58 Taiwan crises, the US threatened to attack China with nuclear weapons. In fact, in 1958, then Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was willing to sacrifice Taiwan to a Soviet retaliatory nuclear attack in what would have been an expanded version of which later became the Vietnam War practice, destroying a village in order to save it. Chinese scholars and policymakers, like many of the US counterparts, know that on as many as 30 occasions, beginning with the 1946 Iran crisis, during international crises and wars, US leaders have repeatedly prepared and or threatened to initiate nuclear war. Nearly a dozen times to reinforce US Middle East hegemony, at least 6 times against North Korea, 4 times during the Vietnam War, and of course during the Cuban Missile Crisis and the 1954 CIA-backed coup in Guatemala. The list includes the Bush-Cheney DEFCON nuclear alert in response to the 9/11 attacks, the 2 Bush wars against Iraq, President Obama's by any means necessary threats against Iran, and Trump's fire and fury threats against North Korea. Professor Xu will address the history, dilemmas, and dangers related to Taiwan. And there is much more to be said about the dangers implicit in the provocative US, Chinese, Japanese, and European shows of force in the South China West Philippine Sea. But with my time limited, that will have to wait for the Q&A period. The sorry truth is that the US policy toward China, be it Obama's, Trump's, or Biden's, demonstrates Einstein's law that insanity is the insistence on doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Millions of lives and national treasure needed to reverse the climate chaos, to vaccinate the world's people, and to fund badly needed social safety nets have been wasted in the tradition of an eye for an eye, leaving everyone blind. Insisting on bludgeoning rivals and pawns into obedience, instead of walking a mile in their shoes, taking their fears, concerns, and legitimate ambitions into account, leaves all but a few poorer, weaker, and more vulnerable. The wiser policy, which at the heights of the Cold War prevented it from turning omnicidally hot, was the pursuit of mutually beneficial common security, diplomatic negotiations to conflicts and resolution of those conflicts that are inevitable in international relations. That's how the INF Treaty was negotiated, and that's how the Cold War ended before the Berlin Wall collapsed. There are alternatives to the nationally self-defeating and toxic US-China threat discourse and to fueling an extremely dangerous nuclear arms race that could climax with nuclear winter and the extermination of all life as we know it. For the US, a first step would be the Nuclear Posture Review adopting a no first use doctrine, prohibiting US presidents from initiating nuclear war. Were the US to join China in its no first use doctrine, it would challenge Putin to do the same, and it would reduce incentives for each of these powers to augment their nuclear arsenals. A second priority must be negotiating a mutually beneficial modus vivendi to prevent accidents, incidents, and miscalculations over Taiwan and in the South China Sea from escalating beyond control and potentially leading to nuclear winter. None of this will be easy, but we must all do what we can to prevent a 21st century and potentially nuclear version of the First World War and to reverse what has become the new Cold War. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing the other speeches.
Thank you, Professor Gerson, for that, for emphasizing and re-emphasizing and reminding us who is the perpetrator of the war, and also reminding us that this is a new Cold War, and which is threatening to become hot war now if we are not very careful with this. Thank you for your remarks. I also welcome Professor Chu, who has logged in and is now with us. Welcome, Professor Chu. And without further ado, let me move on to the third guest of the evening, Professor Ta Wei of Tsinghua University, Beijing. Professor Ta Wei, floor is yours, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Adlaka. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And I'm sorry, I faced some technical problem a couple of minutes ago, so I missed some of the some presenters' points. So I'm very sorry for that. But the good news is I'm back here. So I'll use the time that our host gave me to first to talk about the China-US the Leaders Virtual Summit, my impression, and then I'll touch upon the potential military or war scenario, and yeah, basically these two things. First of all, about the virtual meeting yesterday. I think that's, I would say, a relatively successful meeting. That's, of course, my expectation was not extremely high before the virtual summit. So comparing with my expectation, I will say the meeting itself is, of course, a good thing. As Professor Al-Laha said at the beginning, the two leaders have not met for how long? Anyway, since June 2019. So we badly need this kind of summit. And it, of course, will bring some stability to a very dangerous bilateral relations. For instance, based on the news report I have read, the two sides agreed that maybe the two sides will start a series of dialogue or engagement between the two governments, different teams like financial and economic team and the climate team and others. And also the two sides agreed to lift the visa restriction on the journalist travel to the other side. And the US side is considering lifting or reduction of the tariff. According to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, the two leaders agreed to maybe, I don't know, he did not say the specific time, but start some kind of arms control dialogue or maybe strategic stability dialogue. So these are all good things. And actually before the meeting, the two sides already started a round of thorn, I will say, like the two sides reached the climate joint statement, and the two economic team had already meetings and phone calls, and the two militaries already resumed their dialogues. So these are, of course, a positive momentum that we have not seen in past 2 years. And even on Taiwan issue, though the two sides exchanged a very different view, but I think it's helpful that the two sides, communicate over this issue and let the other side to further understand how important it is for the two sides, the Taiwan issue. Of course, I think that's a good news, a good meeting. And I guess this trend of stability will continue for a while, maybe for another several months, at least before the midterm election in the US and before the 20th Party Congress. The two sides still have some time to try to do some positive things. That said, I won't say I agree with our panelists. This is not a change of the basic framework of China-US relations, of course. Actually, the two countries has already stepped into a new framework, no matter how you define it. The US side define it with strategic competition or long-term competition, while the Chinese side rejected that definition, that characterization. But anyway, we have already stepped into a new framework which is much more negative than the old framework of engagement. So I view this round of warming of the bilateral relations as part of the strategic competition framework. If you want to set up a new framework of strategic competition, you need actually two kinds of action. The first kind of action is those competition or even confrontation part, those hostile, negative part. We're already seeing that in past 2 years and also in the first 6 months of the Biden administration. But only with that kind of action, you cannot finish the whole framework of competition. I think the framework of the competition needs, like the Biden administration, like the word guardrail. Without a guardrail, it's not a strategic competition. So actually what we are seeing, what we are witnessing, I think is the two sides is constructing the guardrail and try to finish the building, the setting up of the strategic competition framework, though China side don't like the term. Of course, I don't know the future of the bilateral relations. Particularly, I'm not sure what the U.S. policy will be after the Biden administration. The U.S. domestic politics, I think, have some uncertainty, but in the at least in the next 2 or 3 years, I assume that the bilateral relations will be stable, though could be very it's in next 3 years will be in tension, but I think it's it will be relatively stable. These are my comments over the virtual meeting. Then my second part, I want to use some time to talk about the potential conflict scenario between the two countries. I think it's, generally speaking, I don't think the possibility of military conflicts between China and the US is very high. I think it's relatively low. I don't think it's very, very likely. I think it's a smaller possibility, not a probability. We have chance to try to prevent it. But for sake of analysis, I still think we have potential of 3 kinds of conflicts. The first one is, I call it intentional conflicts between the two countries. Only one thing can cause intentional conflicts between China and the US. That's the Taiwan issue. And I mean, the two countries, I mean, China and the US know that this issue could lead to a military conflict between the two powers. They, in some circumstances, they have to step into this kind of conflict if the tragedy happened. This is not a war that can be deterred. It's not a war can be deterred by the US because Taiwan issue have really great importance and is extremely sensitive for China. So I think if we want to prevent the war over Taiwan Strait, probably the most important thing is to ensure China's decision maker and also public, the public opinion that the mainland China will not lose Taiwan in foreseeable future. If they feel secured, I think then the military actions could be avoided. But if they feel they are facing this kind of danger, then the situation will be very, very dangerous. I mean, I saw in our chat box one question about one guest raised that question: if China will step into a war, a military conflict, when China knows that the US will get involved. I will say definitely China will. It's not a war that can be deterred. And the second kind of conflict is unintentional conflicts. I think it's mainly the biggest possibility is South China Sea and other, probably basically South China Sea and other in other maritime dispute. I mean, unintentional conflict, I mean contingency, like something that nobody want a current crisis, but something happened, like what we saw with the US submarine USS Connecticut recently. We still don't know the story, but some accident could happen. The third category is I call it unexpected conflict. I'm not worried very much about the first two categories, intentional or unintentional, but I'm a little bit worried about the third category, the military conflict in the new domains and the military conflicts. These led by the emerging new technologies. So we don't know the format of that kind of conflict, and we don't know how can we prevent that kind of conflict. We don't know the logic of the conflict evolution and development in that new domains. I mean, we have never fought a cyber war, for example, so we don't know how to prevent it. We don't know how to prevent a surprise attack. We don't know how to revenge. And we have never fought a war in outer space. So this kind of thing, and we have never fought a war with AI weapon system. And we have never fought a war with ultrasonic, hypersonic weapons. So these are, I think, quite dangerous places, quite dangerous domains that we have to be very clear. To sum up, I think I touched upon those three kinds of conflicts, which I think at least theoretically is possible. But again, I don't think the possibility is very high. And now at least China and the US, both countries already showed very strong aspiration to avoid this kind of war or conflicts. And like in the virtual meeting, the President Xi reiterated China's policy, China's principle of no conflicts and no confrontation, 不冲突,不对抗. That's the first principle he mentioned in the virtual meeting. And we are facing some kind of rivalry, but I will say the historic analogy of Cold War is not accurate, and sometimes it's not helpful because history never repeats. And I think we are smarter than, we are not so stupid that we will just repeat the tragedy of the history. I don't think so. Actually, the situation China and the US are facing is quite different, very different from the Soviet Union and the US. The two countries interdependent each other deeply. And this year, China's exportation towards the United States grew more than 20%. So we have this rivalry, but our economic ties are growing too. And I think the US is trying to adjust its alliance system. And it's not a Cold War style alliance system. It's something very new. We saw the Quad, the AUKUS. That's different from NATO. That's different from the 5 bilateral alliances in East Asia. So India is a very smart country. India, in the Cold War, I think India was very smart, not in any camp. And now we are facing a more complicated situation between China and the US. It's not a clear-cut camp. So I think it's even easier for India to decide that India should not take side between China and the US. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tawei. Thank you for, if I can say so, that we have in you somebody who agrees with Ambassador Sham Saran that without having much expectations, the meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping actually turned out to be more substantive and positive for that. And also, I mean, of course, you took a contrasting position from your previous speaker about the dangers of a military conflict, which you think that you're very confident that at least there is no intentional or unintentional possibility of a conflict between the two powers. And your last remark was about India, and you did say that India is a very smart power or country. So our next speaker has got something to chew on. And Professor Kanti Vajpayee is perhaps going to talk to us about India, how India sees this whole situation. So Professor Vajpayee, the floor is yours.
Yeah, actually, I'm not sure I am, but anyway, although in part I will. Thanks very much, Hemant, and very good to listen to the previous three speakers. I guess I'm in agreement with a number of issues that they have articulated, and I have some differences probably with certainly with Gerson and with our Chinese friend as well. So, I mean, I think that on the whole, I'm not going to say a lot about the summit, meeting, whatever it was. I mean, if it looks like a summit, talks like a summit, walks like a summit, then it's a summit. I don't really care what the readout said about it, whether they didn't use the term or not. So I think there's been a steady build up towards it. And my own reading is that Kerry's discussions on climate change were never really only about climate change. They were a build up towards something like what happened yesterday. And I think that's a pretty open secret. I think that there were some concessions made on both sides. I mean, leading up to it. And I think these have been outlined. The other one I would note there is the release of Meng from Huawei and certain kinds of, it's been said China made no concessions, but I don't think that's quite true. China's also softened some of its language. And there's talk of it buying more US agricultural products, maybe allowing the MAX 737 Boeings to return to the skies, those kinds of things. So, I mean, I would say that it was fairly well orchestrated, with one or two blips perhaps over Taiwan, although whether the Americans really have been chopping and changing and whether Biden's statements are kind of eccentric forgetfulness that he's zany forgetfulness that he's known for, or whether it was part of the ambiguity. Sometimes he talks about, today he was quoted as saying, oh, well, Taiwan will take independent decisions, and that's been walked back by the administration. Sometimes he says, oh, yeah, we're committed to supporting Taiwan in a conflict, and then that's walked back by another arm of the government. Maybe I'm being a bit playful or cynical, but I'm not sure that, it wasn't part of a little bit of kind of American ambiguity over Taiwan. But coming to what I want to say in just a few minutes, I'm not sure I have anything tremendously original to add to some very interesting comments made by everyone. I mean, to me, it is a Cold War, and I don't know why we're pussyfooting around about it. As the previous speaker said, I mean, no two things are the same in history, but if they're close enough, then one might as well call it a Cold War if it's quite illuminating. And it seems to me it is, in terms of the power plays that are going on, the possibility of flashpoints like in the old Cold War, differences in worldviews, if not ideology, and a search for friends and allies. I mean, it's not just the Americans who are searching for friends and allies. Certainly one way of reading the BRI is, and many of Chinese activities developmentally, I mean, I don't think they're all just commercial ventures, nor are they just, kind of good works, and they are a search for friends. Allies is an old-fashioned kind of word, but strategic partners of greater intensity or less so. So, I mean, I would be quite careful in being so dismissive about the fact that it is a Cold War. I don't know why Joe Nye is pussyfooting around the issue either. It's quite clearly, to me, a fairly polarized situation. But perhaps, I mean, what I would say is that, I mean, of course, Cold Wars are dangerous, but Cold Wars have their virtues. They're better than hot wars. They're better than world wars. So I think we oughtn't to get carried away about this idea of the Cold War. And Cold Wars are better than G2s, than condominiums, and partitioning the world into spheres of influence between two powers who, personally, I don't admire either of them too much in critical moments. And I don't think either of them is great for smaller powers. I don't see a great deal of difference in the kind of overbearing magisterial politics that they sometimes play. So yeah, I mean, a Cold War is actually a bit of a reassurance to smaller countries that these two will check and balance each other and perhaps create spaces for more subaltern powers around for smaller players. So I think let's not rush into being dismissive about the idea of the Cold War. Let's not rush into building panicky scenarios about, oh, this is a Cold War and it's all going to blow up and it's all terrible. Yeah, there are dangers there, as there were in previous ones. And by the way, let's talk about Cold Wars in the plural, because the Cold War, the old one, was never just one Cold War. There was a Soviet Union-China Cold War. There was an India-China Cold War at various points. and there was a US-China Cold War at a certain point in time. So I think there are Cold Wars and there are Cold Wars, and this is a new one. To the point that, economic interdependence means it's not so bad. I mean, I would just say that both sides have accused the other side of weaponizing economic interdependence. So the idea that economic interdependence will dampen down everything and so on, I think is also misleading. It may not if it's being weaponized. And Trump sought to weaponize it, maybe Biden is to some extent, and it's not beyond China to weaponize it either by any means. So I think that's my first broad point, that it looks like a Cold War. It may not be the same Cold War, but it's a new Cold War. And I'm not optimistic that interdependence makes it such a different creature and necessarily damps it down. On the other hand, I would say don't panic. As the other speakers have pointed out, there are some responsible, more heartening, reassuring kind of development that have happened recently and might well be carried forward. Yeah, I mean, just coming to India, it's been said that India milked both cows during the old Cold War. I would say that, I don't mean to say that India didn't genuinely, to some extent, stay away from both alliance blocs. It definitely did. To that extent, non-alignment was completely honest, I think, even though India might have tilted this way and sometimes tilted that way. But on the other hand, I mean, non-alignment and the contestation between two big powers does create opportunities for other powers and allows them some bargaining room with the two big ones. The threat that India could tilt this way or that way more permanently, I think it sends a message to Washington and Beijing: don't take us for granted, and don't push us around too much. Don't push Delhi around too much. It could go the other way. So again, I mean, I think, I would, a bipolar Cold War that is being managed more or less well is not altogether bad for countries like India and, of course, for much smaller countries. I think the note asks us to also say what could be done to try and keep things, within the guardrails, as it were. And I think, just as in the Cold War, I mean, India under Nehru and Egypt and Yugoslavia and others made the point that non-alignment is not a passive stance. It's not hiding, it's not neutralism, and it's not just not joining an alliance, but it's kind of an active introjection at critical moments into world politics between big powers to try and speak rationality to both of them, to speak truth to both powers about their conduct, to try and build bridges between them. And I think there are instances when that happened in the Cold War. And I think India, Singapore, which is close to both sides, ASEAN as an organization. And let me raise, again, I might be accused of being slightly playful, but Russia at a critical moment last year seemed to play some kind of a mediating role in the India-China conflict. Is it really beyond possible that Russia could also play something of a bridging role between the United States and China? I'm not sure that that's beyond the possibility ahead. So overall, I would say don't panic. The United States and China know each other very well, going back at least 200 to 300 years. They've had ups and downs, but the United States know China better than any Western country does. Likewise, the Chinese know the US very well, and they probably know the United States better than they know any other Western country. They have very close historical and cultural ties, indeed much deeper than between India and the US, or even India and China, at least over the last 150 years. So there's a kind of social capital there, if you like, between the United States and China, which we shouldn't discount at all. That will, I think that's a positive thing, and it could hold them in good stead. Of course, there are negative perceptions, but there's also, one might say, respect and affection between the two, something that was kind of absent between the United States and Soviet Union, I would say, broadly as a judgment. Finally, I'll just say something on Taiwan. I mean, it is an important issue. I mean, I'd rather share the point of view of our Chinese friend that the possibility of conflict is relatively limited. And I think Xi Jinping said that unless Taiwan behaves really irresponsibly and declares independence or some such, he doesn't really feel that the situation will go to war. So, and I think the Taiwanese know it, and the Americans will be leaning on them. So I think all three players have a good sense. And the idea that the Chinese could just walk into Taiwan and that, they're not deterrable, I don't think that's true. It's not an easy invasion of the islands, even if it happens. And there is an escalatory potential to nuclear weapons. And I think Xi Jinping on one side and Biden on the other will have to ask the question, are they willing to lose Shanghai and New York for Taipei? So it's not quite so simple that China can never be deterred. I wish that was from the Chinese point of view, that might be the case, but I don't think any rational observer would agree with that point of view, given nuclear weapons around, given escalatory potential, and a kind of cost-benefit calculation that you do have to make, no matter what your identity concerns may be. I think some developments that, and I'll just finish with this, that take us beyond just South China Sea and so on, which could be other flashpoints or Senkaku Daewoo. I think developments over the CPTPP is huge, and to my mind, probably more important than AUKUS. And I think members of the CPTPP are going to have to make some very crucial decisions about allowing China to be a member, given that Taiwan has also applied and the UK has also applied. One could say that China won't meet the standards, so there's no big decision to make. But if China makes certain kinds of changes or asks for some temporary dispensations which allow it to join pending those reforms, I think it'll be very difficult for small countries to altogether say no to China. And then there will be huge pressures from the United States on Taiwan, Taiwan's membership. And one can imagine this part of the world, Southeast Asia, quite divided. So I think there are other elements to this Cold War. It's not just Taiwan and the South China Sea. There's a bigger kind of polarization that is possible. I think it was pointed to, but there are gray zone issues as well and how those might play out. So I think I'll just stop there. I think the points, three broad points I made is it looks like a Cold War. Secondly, the Cold War, if it's manageable, is not the worst thing. It does provide space for smaller countries. There are reasons, therefore, for us to, in some ways, prefer the Cold War to other outcomes if you're a smaller country. And I think the Taiwan issue won't blow up. I agree with that, because there is deterrence, and anyone who loses the Taiwan war, or doesn't have an outright quick victory, will be in deep trouble domestically, and that includes Xi Jinping. So I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Professor Bajpai. You have summed up your own presentation, so I need not go there, except that your very interesting take on the kind of summit we'd had between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. I'm reminded of a news report in a newspaper today where it was mentioned, perhaps because it was a virtual meeting, that President Biden and President Xi Jinping were actually not talking to each other, they were talking at each other. So that's a very interesting way of looking at the meeting. And then again, you ended up with a comment on Taiwan. And I think that lays perfect pitch for our next speaker, Professor Chu, who, if I'm correct, is going to concentrate on this dimension of the current US-China tensions or relationship. So Professor Chu, please, the floor is yours. We welcome you.
Thank you, Professor Adlaka, for your kind invitation. Good evening and good morning to all. Actually, I'm not going to talk about Taiwan because it has been mentioned by everybody else in the panel. Anyway, it's a great pleasure and honor to join distinguished experts on this panel. Actually, with the limited time, I'm going to just focus on shifting strategies of the United States in dealing with China. And we can always revisit the Taiwan issue during the Q&A session. So we all know that countering China's rapid rise has become a major challenge for the United States. We all know that President Donald Trump took a confrontation approach towards China. Most notably, he was fighting China single-handedly. President Joe Biden has not completely reversed Trump's tough policies towards China, but he's surely taking a less confrontation approach now. The Biden administration realizes that competition between China and the United States is not going away, and it wants to ensure that competition will not veer into conflict. To avoid conflict, of course, the two powers will have to work together to manage the differences. So in this sense, the virtual meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping a couple of days ago is a move in the right direction. Now, those of you who are familiar with Mao Zedong's quotations, you may remember one of the most famous quotations from Chairman Mao is, "Make the past serve the present and foreign things serve China." It seems that President Biden is taking a cue from Mao and is applying some of the Chinese strategies to deal with China. I would submit that the Biden administration is imitating China's strategies or converging with Chinese perspectives in developing its China policy. I briefly discussed three issues: the Build Back Better world, the United Front, and peaceful coexistence. First, the Build Back Better world, or B3W. The B3W is an initiative undertaken by G7 countries in June 2021, led by the United States. The B3W, which imitates China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, was designed to counter China's global influence. Now, China launched the BRI in 2013 as part of its ambition to expand trade, investment, and influence around the world. Through investing in infrastructure in developing countries, China has increased cooperation and connectivity with dozens of countries in Africa, Asia, Middle East, Europe, and all the way to the Americas. In the process, China's global influence has grown, even to the backyard of the United States. So not to be outperformed, the Biden administration is pushing back Chinese influence in global affairs. The G7 countries plan to provide around 40 trillion US dollars to developing countries by 2035. The funds will be invested in improving conditions in climate change, public health, digital technology, and gender equity and equality. As an alternative to the BRI, I think the B3W is good news for developing countries. China has been kind of alone in promoting global development in the past few years. So the B3W will actually introduce a dose of competition in global development. Healthy competition is welcome because a rising tide lifts all boats. So developing countries will have more options in the infrastructure development, which may lead to higher efficiency, more transparency, and less corruption. These countries may also have the opportunities to work with external investors, which may facilitate coordination and collaboration among foreign investors, including between the United States and China. However, if the B3W is based on zero-sum competition with the BRI, it will create more tensions between China and the West and put many developing countries in an awkward position of having to choose sides. Now, my second point is about this United Front approach. The United Front approach is another strategy the Biden administration has learned from the past and also perhaps from China. Since World War II, the United States has relied on the alliance structure in the foreign policy. Donald Trump trashed multilateralism completely. And now President Biden has returned to the old strategy of forming united fronts in dealing with China. Now, in modern Chinese history, of course, the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Nationalist Party formed a united front twice in dealing with bigger threats. first against the warlords in the 1920s, and then against the Japanese in 1930s, 1940s. The United Front is a strategy that China continues to use today. Biden has met with leaders from major US allies and has attended G7, NATO, and G20 summits in Europe. On every occasion, China is ostensibly an absent participant and the key topic of discussion. Shortly after G7 summit in England in June, Biden met with Russian President Putin in Geneva in an effort to form a united front to combat China. Now, in addition to strengthening existing groups that are arguably aimed at China, such as the Quad, the Five Eyes, the Biden administration recently formed a new united front with the United Kingdom and Australia, named AUKUS. Just like Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, who teamed up with China against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, Biden tried to curry favor with Putin and drive a wedge between Russia and China. But Russian-China relations are pretty strong now. So shortly after Biden-Putin summit, Putin and Xi Jinping actually met virtually and reaffirmed their personal bond, as well as the close relationship between the two sides. So Putin obviously will not join the United States against China. And even US allies, such as Germany, Italy, Greece, and South Korea, for example, prefer a less confrontation approach towards China, despite their shared concerns about China's policies. So Biden is actually facing some hurdles in applying the United Front strategy against China. My third and final point is about the term cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Now, China has long suggested that it does not intend to replace the United States as the global leader, and it does not want to use confrontation and conflict to define the US-China relationship. It prefers cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Guess what? The United States under President Biden is moving in China's direction. Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, recently said the United States will not repeat the errors of the past by trying to transform China. The United States wants peaceful existence with China, not a new Cold War. The goal here is not containment. It's not a new Cold War, quote unquote, Sullivan said in an interview to CNN recently. Now, during the just concluded Biden-Xi virtual summit, President Biden also said the two countries should ensure that competition will not veer into conflict, and they should establish some common sense guardrails and work together where their interests intersect, especially on vital global issues like climate change. So this new strategy of seeking cooperation and peaceful coexistence sounds so familiar and so Chinese. You may think that Biden appears to be lacking creativity in dealing with China by imitating Chinese strategies or gradually converging with Chinese perspectives of the relationship. He may even be criticized by some at home for being too soft on China. I think it's perhaps premature to determine whether the Biden administration's China policy will succeed or not. But it's important to note that the Biden administration is trying to avoid confrontation with China and work with China where their interests align. Now, finally, the US-China relationship is multifaceted with potentials for both cooperation and competition, as other speakers have noted. Countering China without finding ways to cooperate, like what the Trump administration did, will create more problems and tensions for the already troubled relationship. So it is encouraging that President Biden and President Xi are candid about the differences between the two sides, but have vowed to work together to deal with common challenges, despite the differences. So if they continue to do so, perhaps the US-China relationship will not be so problematic. And I'm cautiously optimistic that the relationship will improve in the future. Thank you, and I'll stop here.
Thank you, Professor Chu. I'll just pick up one point from your presentation and say that, I mean, you were right, perhaps, because there is a section of opinion in America in particular, which says that President Biden has been too soft on China so far. And the example they give is that he let the Chinese get away with what was happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong, etc., etc. And I mean, that is also to be taken into account in our discussion. Now, with all the 5 guests having spoken, I'm sure everyone will agree with me that we've been not even satisfied in terms of getting a kind of appetizer from them, and we needed perhaps each one of them to come and give a separate webinar some other time. We will try to arrange that in the future. But also, I think everyone will agree with me that since all the speakers also left a lot of things unsaid, thinking that they will get some time during the Q&A. So perhaps we can extend the time instead of what the original concluding time was 7:30. Perhaps we can extend it by another 15 minutes or so if the organizers and our guests have no problem with the extra time being used for the discussion. With these couple of things, I will now request, because I was listening to all the speakers, so I did not get time to look at the chat box. So I will request our young ICS help, Shruti, if she can help me go to the chat box and, or rather, I mean, my request will be to all those people who have written questions in the chat box, if they're willing to speak up their questions rather than to be read out, that will perhaps save time. So my first request to all the questioners would be that if you are willing to, yes, very good. I can see 4 hands raised. So may I begin with Ambassador Goel first? Ambassador Goel, please introduce yourself and be very brief because we have very limited time. Yes. Professor Goel, are you there? Ambassador Goel, are you there?
Sorry, yes. No, my comment is very simple. Basically, it's my sense from all the speeches and the reports clearly that the meeting or the virtual meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden has not been able to really, reduce or diminish in any sense the idea of a Cold War between China and the USA, which continues, really speaking. The hard line taken by Xi Jinping in the conversation was rather revealing. And there is also combined with that the sense that Xi Jinping may be under greater pressure to deliver on his aggressive stance in view of his new position as the exalted leader at the CCP. So my question to the panel really is, what would the USA do in the event that President Xi Jinping does take a military action against Taiwan in view of what the new commitment is or what actually his position in the CCP is? Or would Xi Jinping actually undertake a military action which may lead to USA retaliation? Because that is where it really lies. It's a trigger point now, Taiwan. Thank you very much, Professor Abdullah Khan.
Okay, since you did not specify whom you are addressing your question and you said this is for the whole panel, so let's see who would be, or shall I go in the order of the speakers? And may I request Ambassador Saran to respond to this question?
Thank you. These are very hypothetical questions. I mean, what will happen if, China does invade Taiwan, and, what would the US do? I think what we need to perhaps look at is that, as I mentioned in my remarks, that some guardrails, very fragile guardrails, seem to be in the process of being put in place. One important thing is that the US has reaffirmed its position regarding Taiwan, that it does not support Taiwan independence. And that, I think, assurance is important for China. Because China has been saying that it is under the encouragement of the United States that some of the pro-independence elements in Taiwan have been getting more bold. So the US assurance is important. I think it has also been conveyed, perhaps not so clearly, but conveyed that if that does not happen, if the independence movement does not really take hold, the focus from China will still be on peaceful reunification. That is what China would want, but of course it will react if there is a move towards independence. So that's I think the kind of I wouldn't say an agreement, but a kind of as I said, putting the guardrails in place has taken place. There could be miscalculations, of course, on both sides. I think the United States of America has very clearly stated that it follows a policy of strategic ambiguity. Nobody will know whether the US will respond militarily if there was an invasion of Taiwan. Now, the problem with strategic ambiguity is that it can be both ways. That there could be a possibility that the US will not respond if an invasion of Taiwan takes place. So it does not give us any new information in a sense. But my sense is, looking at the whole situation, my sense is that both sides have taken a step, only a step, towards reducing tensions and the possibility of miscalculation or unintended kind of escalation on the Taiwan issue. That's what my sense is.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. Professor Gerson, would you like to say something on the same question?
Sure. So first of all, my sense is that the greatest danger would grow out of an accident, with the military confrontations and shows of force being taken by both the United States and China. So if we have a crash of airplanes or a young sailor on either side pushes a button for a missile launch, the challenge to contain escalation would be great. So that's where I see the greatest danger. I think in terms of the hypothetical, and I don't live in China. I can't say that I'm an expert on China, but I think the reality is that Chinese leaders understand there'd be a huge cost from out of nowhere to be invading Taiwan. The economic ramifications globally, which would then impact China's domestic stability, would be huge. And there's the reality that I think there's an understanding that to integrate and to reunify, there's a need to win Taiwanese hearts and minds. Without winning those hearts and minds, the kind of repression that would be required and the kind of resistance that Chinese forces would face over time would be great. So I think the only scenario we can see in this regard would be if the Taiwanese independence forces do what they know, what the world knows they shouldn't do, to be taking irreversible steps toward de jure independence. In terms of how the U.S. would respond, say in this crisis, a lot would depend on who was the president of the United States, which forces are dominant in the U.S. at that time. I think the with Biden, it's been very clear that if the crisis is initiated by Taiwanese political leaders, there would be a much less chance of the United States intervening. On the other hand, if China were to, from out of nowhere, launch an attack on Taiwan, I think the political pressures here in the United States would be great and could force even a Biden to have to respond militarily. Here we face the danger of escalation, and the danger of escalation to a nuclear exchange. I mean, most of the tabletop games that I'm aware of have ended with the United States losing at a conventional, so-called conventional level, and then responding with nuclear weapons. And I think the 1958 crisis serves as a sobering dimension of reality.
Thank you, Professor Gerson. I appreciate that. Now, if I may use my discretion as the chair and ask and request Professor Chu to give me a brief comment answer to a point which I wish to ask him, is that he did mention in his presentation about B3W, and also that is almost like China's BRI, and the US plans to spend around $40 trillion, if I remember you mentioned it, by 2035 or so. So can I request you to make a comment on, because the other day when the infrastructure bill was passed by President Biden, announced by President Biden, at least a section of the US media I saw is saying that is, I mean, forget about the rhetorics and the populist so-called it is for workers' welfare and all that. The actual content or the substance is actually to help gear up to compete with China, to put the American economy back on rail. Could you comment on that? On
Yes,
the infrastructure bill?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, there are two components here, when I say B3W, that's the, if you like, that's the international component of the plan. But what we are talking about here is the domestic portion. I think, yes, you're right, because of this infrastructure bill was recently approved by the Congress. And so Biden will be able to focus on domestic infrastructure building, and which we all know is dilapidated, and I think it is high time that the United States spent more money on domestic infrastructure. But the international dimension of B3W, I think it's still up in the air, unlike the BRI that has been implemented for 8 years now. The B3W remains a concept, actually, without specific plans yet. And it faces many challenges. For example, who exactly will foot the bill? I mean, domestic, for the domestic build back better, that's for sure. The United States Congress will allocate the money for that. For the B3W, the international build back better. There's no clear idea here. Who is going to foot the bill? Are G3 countries capable of actually developing new infrastructure, since the infrastructure in many of these countries themselves is so dilapidated? And how substantial will this initiative be? I mean, in 4 years, and probably none of the current G7 leaders will still be in power. Will their successors still support this plan? So there's so much uncertainty about the B3W. I doubt it will actually pose a serious challenge to China's BRW, BRI, I mean. I think, it is a priority for President Biden to focus on domestic infrastructure. Forget about the B3W. And I think that's just a vision, a concept. I think substantively, the United States definitely needs to do a better job at home if it wants to compete with China or any other rivals. If you don't do a better job at home, how can you compete internationally? I think that has been a consensus, I think, within the United States. We got to spend more, and that is happening now. I don't know whether I answered that question, though.
Yes. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And now I can still see there are 4 raise hand people wanting to ask questions. May I request somebody among the raise hands, if you have a question to Professor Bajpai or Professor Tave, because the other 3 speakers have actually responded to in Q&A session, at least once each. So may I request the questioner to first ask question to, if they have any question to Professor Bajpai.
Yes,
or
I do
Professor
have a
Tave.
question to, yes, I do have a question to Professor Bajpai. This is Indranil Bhole from Mumbai, from the,
Yes,
I
please
am
go
a
ahead.
student
Please,
there. Yeah.
yeah, please go ahead.
I have put that into the chat box, but I will repeat the question in a sense that, I mean, do these meetings, honestly, do they deal with any other nations, fairly important nations like India and their concerns? Because see, we are all over here in India, and overwhelmingly the audience is India, so is Indian. So please, please tell us whether they at all discuss or give importance to our border issues and IOR mainly, our new emerging field of conflict, IOR. And do we, by the way, do we at all proactively act with, at least with US before the conference? So before this Xi Biden conference, so that please take us our issue also. I mean, you know, so do something like this happen at all? These kind of moves, you know.
Okay. Okay.
That's what I wanted to know.
Well,
Okay. Professor Bajpai?
The short answer is I have absolutely no idea what they talked about in the 3 hours that weren't public. So, but I mean, drawing on the historical analogy of the other Cold War, the old one, the United States and Soviet Union, particularly in the Kissinger period, did seek to have some tacit or more explicit understandings about their conduct in third areas. And at least one of the complaints of the Americans later was that Moscow didn't hold to those, but Kissinger did attempt, to get understandings of that, with his great meta-Nickean kind of historical framework where in the concert of powers, there were intricate tacit and formal bargains and understandings and so on about their conduct, including in third areas, which was, I suppose, in large part the colonial world at that time. He sought to do something similar through the idea of linkage politics and so on. It wouldn't be past Xi Jinping and Biden to have broached some of those issues beyond Taiwan, perhaps the South China Sea and so on. But my instinct is that in this first meeting, I think their bilateral issues, Taiwan, trade, and those kinds of issues are far more central. I don't know how much they would have turned their attention to India, frankly, or the Indian Ocean region. And perhaps we'll never know till someone writes a memoir. But, and as to whether India, knowing that this summit was coming up, asked the Americans to kind of table some issues. Again, I just don't know. I mean, quite possibly, but and it would have been some good, smart diplomacy if they did, I suppose. But I really can't say. Maybe some of our former diplomats here on the Indian side could give us some insight on that.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Bajpai. But I think the question has its merit.
I'm not trying to be dismissive. I'm just saying I just don't know.
Yeah. Of course. Okay, thank you. May I now request Professor Sandeep Mishra to ask his question?
Good evening, Chair. Actually, good evening, everybody. My question is to Professor Kanti Bajpai. Professor Kanti Bajpai mentioned about, he said that China-US relations is looking like a Cold War, and it's like a Cold War. And I think I was really happy to hear that actually there could be multiple Cold Wars, actually. It's not singular, but it's a plural. There could be multiple types of Cold Wars, and there were multiple Cold Wars going along at the same time. My question is that even this Cold War, suppose we call it Cold War between US and China, can't we also differentiate between different type? You can say Cold War, sometimes they become quite intense, sometimes they are not so intense. And why I'm asking that, because if I look at, say, South Korea, I study about Korea largely, and I see that actually in the Cold War, as Professor Bajpayee tried to say, that the middle powers, or say smaller country, they are going to have much more space. But quite contrary, when the intensity is very high, when the slow is good for smaller and medium powers, but the intensity is very high, then it becomes quite difficult for them. For example, in last 1 month, it had been quite, you can say, issue in South Korea that some products coming from China, coal and other, they are used for diesel, and they have been looking for alternate sources. So I'm saying that how is going to, you can say, the intensity of Cold War, and it's basically negative implication for Southeast Asia, South Asia, and other, you can say, East Asian country. Thank you.
Okay,
yeah, well, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, there are seasons in the Cold War, in any Cold War. Sometimes it's worse and sometimes it's not so bad. And there's human agency there. If the two countries, as at the moment, seem to be in a relatively stable situation in and around this summit, that's good. So again, I mean, I guess the only thing I was saying was that the note from ICS and seemed to kind of portray the Cold War as being necessarily this emerging polarization, Cold War tensions, whatever you want to call it, between the two, as being very dangerous, and we should all be very nervy about it. And I'm just trying to provide something of a corrective to that, to say, don't panic. I mean, it's not all bad for those on the sidelines, as it were. I mean, there are opportunities for them. There may be agency for them, and certain kinds of advantages. Of course, it may all blow up, who knows? But even in the old Cold War, it wasn't that the other smaller countries had no choices and that they couldn't impact or influence anything. If you read all the emerging work based on archival sources now that's coming out about the rich complexity of responses in regions, it shows that there was a lot going on to resist, to avoid, to influence the two big blocks. So that's all I'm saying. I mean, yeah, sometimes your choices will be constrained.
Okay, thank you. May I have a quick question for Professor Tawai, and I will read it out from the chat box. So there is a question. Yeah. There is a question about Professor Tawai for you, that somebody has written in the chat box. I think Mr. Ranjit Kumar, that do we expect President Xi Jinping to continue his aggressive posture at least until the next party congress, which is next year? I think he's maybe referring to also, as the media has reported about the meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping, that when Xi Jinping made this remark that America should stop playing with fire. I think that is a reference to his aggressiveness in general. Professor Tawai, and also Captain Kiran has asked a question in the chat box. Let me combine the two so that Professor Tawai can answer the two questions together. The Captain Kiran has asked you that why should Taiwan give up its freedom, the kind of freedom they have been enjoying? Why are they expected to give up their freedom? Professor Tawai?
Yes, thank you, Professor. I think these two questions, very difficult questions, right? First of all, if you ask Chinese, let's say if you ask an ordinary Chinese on the street of Beijing, do you think President Xi or China's foreign policy is aggressive? They will say, no, they're too soft. So how do we view the foreign policy, if that's aggressive or not? It depends on where do you sit. So I don't think Chinese people believe that. Actually, I think the majority, actually just this afternoon, I have a big debate with my old friend, and we broke each other. We broke our relationship because he blames that our government is too soft. Too soft to South Korea and to Japan. Anyway, I think I said no, that's not true. But anyway, I mean, it depends on where are you sitting. Chinese people have a lot of criticism over the US. For instance, many people today in the panel mentioned Xinjiang, Tibet, Taiwan, or human rights. So let's imagine what will happen if China imposes sanctions over US for gun violence domestically. What will happen if China imposes sanctions for January 6th Congress riot for damaging the democratic principle? And what will happen if China imposes sanctions over the US for 700,000 people died from COVID because they had a wrong guidance from their president? So I mean, China had never done this. We have never think about that. So we need to think, we need to exchange, put our feet in the other side's shoes. I mean, so I don't think China's foreign policy is aggressive. Of course, I understand why some people say China's foreign policy is aggressive. I mean, we need to have intellectually be empathetic. I think this is very important. And also, I don't think that's very related to China's domestic political agenda. I say China will be hawkish before the party congress and will be dovish after the party congress. I don't think so. I think if we believe that China's foreign policy has changed to some extent, I don't think it's directly related to China's domestic relations. It's more about China's interaction, China's relationship with foreign countries. And to Captain's question, China has never said the people in Taiwan should abandon their way of life. But what mainland China insists is sovereignty over the island. I think I'm Chinese and Captain, you are Indian. So I think we need to sympathize to each other. Let's think about that. India has also have your disputed territory. If I ask, I don't want to be offensive, actually, to be honest, but if I ask people who live in the disputed territory, I won't say where it is, but anyway, you have disputes with your neighboring countries. If I ask people why you should abandon your way of life for India, I think Indian friends will say what I said is offensive. So I mean, we need to, and for those two questions, I fully understand why these two questions are raised, but I mean, we are all developing countries. We are all victims of colonialism. So we have to try to understand each other, put your feet in the other side's shoes, understand why, where did those questions, problems, disputes arise? I think that's very important for countries like China and India. That's I don't know if that's an answer or not, but I try to answer this tough question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tawei, for being very candid. May I now request Devjyoti Saha to ask the question?
Yeah, good evening, respected panelists. My question is specifically addressed to Professor Joseph Gerson and Professor Davi, both of them. So recently we have witnessed China making some really incredible offensive nuclear advancements, and Pentagon assumes that by 2030, China might near 1,000 nuclear warheads, and specifically the hypersonic missile that China recently developed, which General Milley has termed as the Sputnik moment of China. With these developments coming in, can we expect a US-China version of sort of agreement in the near future to avoid possible nuclear conflicts in Indo-Pacific region? That's it, sir. Thank you.
Professor Gerson, your response first.
It's difficult to know where discussions will go. My understanding is that to this point, on the Chinese side, the sense has been that the U.S. threat and capability is so overwhelming, and with the U.S. and Russia holding something like over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons, there needed to be major agreements and reductions by the United States and Russia before China would move to engage in serious negotiations. You also have the at this point the reality of the U.S. nuclear threat being as great as it is in relationship to China. So it's going to be difficult. The reality is that the arms race is dynamic. You go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when at the beginning, McNamara, who played a hard line through much of it, said, in reality, having Soviet missiles in Cuba was relatively insignificant because there would be parity in time anyhow. So it's very clear that at some point, some form of negotiations will be necessary. We have to signal out of the summit or whatever we want to call it, that there will be discussions about nuclear weapons, but I wouldn't expect major movements anytime soon. Maybe some signaling to establish some guardrails against the unintended, the unwanted. But I think we're a long way between serious nuclear treaties between the United States and China. I would just say that we're coming up on the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, and it would be wonderful if the U.S. and China could signal some kind of activity, some sort of progress toward actually fulfilling their Article 6 commitments. So quick and dirty.
Thank you, Professor Gerson. Professor Tawey, your response to the question?
I'm sorry, I missed the question. Can you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So my question was that with the recent advancements that China has made in its offensive nuclear program, can we expect a US-China version of a START or SWORD deal in near future to prevent any kind of nuclear conflicts in Indo-Pacific?
I don't think it's very likely in the near future. I think now it's if the news report is correct that maybe China will try to negotiate with the U.S. And actually, during Obama administration, China and the U.S. already had a round of strategic stability dialogue. I think in New York, in the last several months of Obama administration. But then when Trump came into power, then it's stopped. But now we have a chance that the two sides to resume that kind of dialogue. But I don't think China will in the near future. I don't think it's possible for China to have any outcome. And I don't think it will. I don't think it will be a multilateral or trilateral dialogue. I think probably that's China-U.S. dialogue, but it takes time, maybe a decade or something. I don't know, but it's a long-term thing, I guess.
Thank you, Professor Tawey. I think we have exceeded our time. And my apologies to the raise hand questioners and also to some questions which may not have been answered in the chat box because of the limitations of time. So I would be now concluding today's event. I thank ICS and I also thank the ICS Director, Ambassador Ashok Kanta, for making it possible to hold today's event. And I'm really feeling very privileged and honored to be chairing this meeting today because we have such an eminent panel of guests. I know the time was very limited for each speaker. Perhaps we wanted to listen to them more, but I'm sure we will in the future have more opportunities to invite them and give us share with us their views in more time allotted to them and more question and answer time. With these words, I would now declare this meeting closed, and my due apologies to both Professor Gerson and Professor for having pulled them out of bed so early in the morning. And also, I also sincerely apologize to Professor Tawi and Professor Kanti Bajpai for keeping them engaged so late in the night after dinner. With these words, I thank you all of you for participating in this, and my heartfelt thank to the guest speakers who, when I approached them to participate in this event, instantly agreed. I really appreciate their cooperation and understanding. So that's it.